In this video, we're going to take a look at how to solve a quadratic if it's not factorable. So there's something called the quadratic formula that we can use to solve a quadratic. And where this comes from is if we take the general quadratic, which is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, and we solve it using a method of completing the square, and we're not going to go over that. But what happens is at the very bottom, when you solve for x, you get this formula for the general quadratic solution. Notice it's in terms of a's, b's, and c's, which are the numerical coefficients of your x squared, your x term, and your constant. So if we know what a, b, and c are, we can substitute it into this formula and then use order of operations to simplify. So this is if also it works for every quadratic. So if you're not very good at factoring or you're just not real competent, quadratic formula always works. So let's see how it works. Our first example, we've got 2x squared minus 7x minus 5 equals 0. It's in the right form, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Identify your a, in this case is 2, b is equal to negative 7, and c is equal to negative 5. Notice we keep the sign with the number. Then we put it in the formula. X equals negative whatever b is, negative 7, plus or minus the square root of, notice I'm putting parentheses around as I substitute them in, negative 7 squared minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is negative 5. Putting parentheses around your numbers as you substitute them in the formula, make sure that you keep the negative signs with your numbers. All over 2 times a is 2. Now we can simplify, and this is going to take a few steps. Negative negative is a positive 7, plus or minus the square root. Now we're going to simplify the inside of the square root. Negative 7 squared means negative 7 times negative 7, which is a positive 49. So that term will always result in a positive number. Now we have negative 4 times positive 2 times negative 5, which ends up being a positive 40. All over 2 times 2, which is 4. Next step. X equals 7 plus or minus the square root of 49 plus 40 is 89, all over 4. 89 is not a perfect square, and it can't be simplified. So to leave an exact form, this plus or minus means that you have two solutions. 7 plus the square root of 89 over 4, and your other solution is 7 minus the square root of 89 over 4. Okay, if you need a decimal approximation, you would go ahead and put that in the calculator. Make sure when you put it in the calculator that you have parentheses around the numerators. So if you put that in a calculator, we get 7 plus the square root of 89, and round at the end. Type it all in and round at the very end. So 7 plus the square root of 89 over 4 is about, you have to estimate, 4.11 about. And if we do 7 minus the square root of 89, and then divide that answer by 4, we end up with about a negative 0.61. Okay, so check and make sure that you can get the order of operations in the calculator for those two. So exact answer are leaving it in terms of the radical. An approximation to the nearest hundredth is if you put that in the calculator and estimate. Okay. All right, next example, we're going to solve using quadratic formula 9x squared plus 24x plus 16. So in this case, a is 9, b is 24, c is equal to 16. So this is where you really want to make sure that you're keeping track. These are large numbers. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. Oop, and a is 9, so that's 2 times 9. Next step, I'm going to leave the negative 24 plus or minus, and I'm going to put in the calculator 24 squared minus 4 times 9 times 16, so I can see what's underneath the square root. So I've got 24 squared minus 4 times 9 times 16, and I end up with a 0 in there, over 2 times 9, which is 18. So the square root of 0 is 0. So what happens on here is you're left with a single answer, negative 24 over 18, and we reduce our fraction. Let's see, 6 goes into both of those. So we get a single answer, x is equal to negative 4/3. And if you look back at the original problem, this is actually a perfect square trinomial that factors into 3x plus 4 squared. And that's how we end up with the negative 4/3. So you could have solved this by quadratic formula, or you could have solved it by factoring. All right, next example, we want to solve 3x squared minus 5x plus 4. Okay, so we substitute our a, b, and c. A is 3, b is negative 5, c is equal to 4. So x equals negative b. Again, I've got the parentheses because b is a negative 5, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Negative negative gives us a positive 5 plus or minus. Now we go ahead and have negative 5 squared, which is positive 25. I'll do a little scratch work up here. 25 minus 4 times 3 is 12 times 4 is 48. So what's going to happen in there is we're going to end up with a negative number, a negative 23 over 6. So whenever we have a negative, that means that we have no real answer. There's not a real number whose square root, that if you square it, you end up with a negative number. Okay? So the answer is complex numbers. And if we were going to work with complex numbers, it would be 5 plus or minus I times the square root of 23 over 6. Okay? So, but for us, if it ends up being a negative under the square root, we're going to say no real answer. But there are answers in terms of complex numbers. All right, last one. I'm not going to solve the whole thing, but I included this one because sometimes you're given s squared equals 4 plus s times 7 minus 8s. Sometimes you're given the equation and it's not in the right form. So we want to make sure that you get this in the right form first. So we've got to do some work up front. So if we have s squared equals 4 plus, distribute the s, 7s, minus s times negative 8s is negative 8s squared. I want to make sure I get everything on one side, so I'm going to add 8s squared. I get 8 plus 1 is 9s squared. And these two terms I'm going to take to the other side. Minus 7s minus 4 is equal to 0. So this is just to make sure you get it in the right form, make sure it's a quadratic. Then we can use our quadratic formula, where a is 9, b is negative 7, and c is negative 4. All right, well, we might as well try it. You go ahead and try it, I'll try it. Let's see what we get at the end. So x equals negative b, negative 7, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 AC all over 2a. So x equals 7 plus or minus the square root of, take the calculator, we end up with 49. Now we're going to have a negative 4 times positive 9 times negative 4, so we're going to end up with a plus. We end up with 193 over 18. So the square root of 193, check and see if it's a perfect square. It is not. And it does not simplify. The solution says type an exact answer. That means leave it in radicals. Use a comma to separate. So our two solutions are 7 plus the square root of 193 all over 18, and 7 minus the square root of 193. 193 over 18.